The sun was starting to dip behind the skyline, casting long shadows across the city. The air was thick with the hum of traffic, the chatter of people heading home after a long day, and the distant sounds of the bustling urban life that never seemed to stop. But amid all that noise, there was a voice that stood out. A child's cry, raw and desperate. Lucas, an 8-year-old boy, his small frame dwarfed by the towering buildings around him, sprinted down the crowded street. His knees were scraped, his clothes torn, and his breath came in short, panicked gasps. Tears streamed down his face, blurring his vision, but he didn't care. All that mattered was getting help. The image of his mother being dragged away by authorities haunted him. He couldn't lose her. He just couldn't. "Help! Please! Somebody help!" Lucas's voice cracked as he shouted, his words swallowed up by the noise of the street, but still desperate enough to pierce through the chaos. He ran past groups of people who didn't spare him a second glance, his fear and desperation barely registering in their busy minds. For a moment, the city seemed like a cold, indifferent place. Nobody stopped. Nobody moved. Lucas's cries echoed off the walls of the buildings, only to be swallowed by the noise of the world continuing to spin. At the end of the street, Officer Thompson, a man whose uniform symbolized authority and power, was patrolling the area. He walked slowly, scanning the scene with a practiced eye, looking for trouble, as he had done countless times before. His job was simple: keep the peace, enforce the law, and ensure that nothing went wrong. He was used to dealing with rowdy teenagers, petty criminals, and the occasional fight. But this was different. As he heard Lucas's frantic cries, something tugged at his chest. He paused, eyes narrowing as he looked down the street. There, in the distance, was the source of the distress. A young boy, alone, running wildly through the crowd. Officer Thompson's instincts kicked in, but they were clouded by years of bias, years of assumptions based on his experiences and preconceived notions. It didn't help that Lucas was black, a fact that subtly shaped Thompson's perceptions, even if he didn't consciously recognize it. The officer hesitated. Was the child in real danger? Was there something more to this story? Thompson had dealt with situations before where the truth wasn't what it seemed. Was this just another attempt to cause trouble, or was something deeper happening? His grip on his baton tightened, his mind running through possibilities. The boy was crying, but how often did people cry wolf? "Hey, you there!" Officer Thompson called out, striding toward Lucas. His voice was stern, the words more of an order than a question. The boy didn't stop running, his face still contorted with fear, his body trembling. "Please, help! My mom! They took her! They're gonna hurt her!" Lucas's voice shook, but his words were clear. He stopped just in front of the officer, chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. His small hands were raised, palms facing out in a gesture that was part plea, part protection, as if the officer's presence only made his fear worse. Officer Thompson stood there, his hand hovering near his holstered gun, as his gaze flickered from the boy to the busy street. He took a moment, scanning Lucas up and down, his tear-streaked face, his disheveled clothes, and the way his little body seemed to collapse under the weight of the emotions overwhelming him. Lucas was wearing a faded blue t-shirt, too big for his frame, and a pair of scuffed jeans. The shoes on his feet were mismatched, showing signs of wear. The backpack slung over his shoulder hung loosely, with only a few toys peeking out. He looked every bit the part of a scared child, desperate for help. Still, the officer's mind churned with doubt. He had seen so many lies, so many false reports, so many attempts to manipulate situations. Could this be one of those times? Could this just be a misunderstanding? His instincts, shaped by years of dealing with a community that often distrusted him, told him to be wary. But then, Lucas's next words broke through the officer's thoughts like a knife cutting through fog. "They took her. They took my mom, and they're gonna hurt her if we don't stop them. Please, you have to help me." The boy's voice cracked again, his body trembling with emotion that threatened to break him apart. The words hit Officer Thompson hard, shaking him to his core. He had no reason to doubt the boy now. The raw fear in Lucas's eyes, the sincerity in his voice, were too real to ignore. Despite his biases, despite the assumptions that had clouded his judgment just moments ago, Thompson felt the grip of something different: guilt. It was in that moment, as Lucas's innocent plea hung in the air, that the officer realized the weight of what had just happened. Lucas's voice had shattered not only his perception of this situation, but also the walls he had built around himself. The boy's cry for help had cracked open a part of Officer Thompson's worldview that he hadn't even known was locked away. The officer looked down at Lucas, and for the first time, he didn't see just a child. He saw a person in pain, a person desperate for someone to believe him. It was too late to question the boy's sincerity. In the brief silence that followed, Officer Thompson's face softened, and his skepticism faded. "I'll help you," he said quietly, finally seeing the truth in Lucas's eyes. "Tell me where they took your mom." Lucas, trembling and still unsure, pointed shakily down the street, toward the flashing lights of the authorities ahead. And for the first time, Officer Thompson began to believe. Lucas had lived in a neighborhood where every day felt like a struggle to survive. It was a place where the streets were worn, the buildings were aging, and the air was thick with the weight of inequality. He had seen firsthand how the world viewed people like him, black, poor, and caught in a system that was designed to keep them down. The fear that gripped his heart every time a siren blared or a police car rolled down the street wasn't just a feeling. It was a reality he carried with him every day. His mother, a hard-working woman who had done everything she could to provide for him, was no stranger to the harsh realities of the world they lived in. She worked 2 jobs, often staying up late into the night, just to make sure that Lucas had enough to eat and a roof over his head. But no matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she sacrificed, the world still saw her as less than, seen through the lens of prejudice and bias that ran deep within the fabric of their society. It wasn't just the looks she received when she walked into stores, or the whispers that followed her as she crossed the street. It was the way the police treated her. Lucas had been old enough to understand for a while now that his mother, despite her dedication and hard work, was viewed with suspicion wherever she went. She had been pulled over by police more times than he could count, often for trivial reasons. Her car wasn't new enough, or she had been driving just a little too fast, or sometimes there was no reason at all, just a decision that she looked out of place in a neighborhood where people like her didn't belong. Lucas had witnessed these moments, sitting in the passenger seat of her car, his small hands gripping the armrest as the police officer's cold eyes met his mother's, as though she were the one causing trouble simply by existing in their sightline. When Lucas was younger, he didn't fully understand why it happened. But now, as he was growing older, he was starting to see the pattern, a system that treated his mother like a criminal without cause, simply because of the color of her skin. He had seen it when she was unfairly dismissed from jobs, when she was made to wait longer than others in stores, when people looked at her as if she were invisible, or worse, a threat, how it made her feel. She would come home, her shoulders slumped from the weight of the day, and she'd try to smile for him, as if everything was fine. But Lucas knew it wasn't. He could see it in the lines etched into her face, the weariness that seemed to grow with each passing day. And despite all her efforts to shield him from the worst of it, Lucas felt the weight of it too. He was starting to understand that the world was not a kind place, not for people like him, and not for people like his mother. In their neighborhood, the division was impossible to ignore. On one side, there were the pristine, affluent White Sea, but what hurt Lucas most wasn't just seeing the way the world treated his mother. It was seeing immunities, neighborhoods that boasted manicured lawns, perfect homes, and families that rarely, if ever, had to worry about anything beyond what's for dinner. But on the other side of the tracks, the reality was starkly different. Families like Lucas's lived in homes that were crumbling, their streets full of potholes, their parks neglected, and their schools underfunded. This divide wasn't just physical. It ran deeper, into the very core of the city's identity. The systemic racism that plagued every aspect of their lives was a constant reminder that they weren't truly part of the city. They were separated, isolated, and, in the eyes of so many, irrelevant. Lucas had grown up in this world, where hope was a fleeting thought, and every step he took felt like one in the shadow of a system that would never see him as equal. His mother had tried to explain things to him in small doses as he grew older. She had tried to shield him from the worst of the world while also teaching him about it. She'd spoken to him about how people would see him differently when he got older, how they would treat him as if he didn't belong, just like they treated her. She had tried to prepare him, but no amount of preparation could shield him from the truth that he was now facing. The truth that the system was against him, that his skin color was something that could define his entire life. And now, Lucas's fear had crystallized into something tangible. His mother had been taken by the authorities, just as she had been taken before, but this time it felt different. This time, it wasn't just a routine stop. This time, Lucas could feel in his bones that something much worse was happening. The city's pervasive injustice had reached into his life once again, and this time, he had no control. The fear that Lucas carried with him wasn't just the fear of losing his mother. It was the fear of losing everything, of being powerless, just like his mother had been so many times before. It was the fear that, despite everything she had done for him, despite the love and sacrifices she had given, the world would never truly care about them. And that was why, in that moment of desperation, Lucas didn't just cry out for help. He cried out for justice. He cried out for someone, anyone, to see him and his mother for who they really were. Not as problems to be dealt with, but as human beings who deserved dignity, respect, and love. The city's broken system had been shaping Lucas's world from the start, but in his frantic cry he hoped, just for a moment, that someone would listen, that someone would hear the truth in his words and do something about it. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest as he sprinted down the street, his small feet slapping against the cracked pavement. His breath came in desperate gasps, each one heavier than the last, as the adrenaline surged through his veins. His mother. They had taken her. She was supposed to be at home, resting, but now she was gone, taken by people who didn't care about her, didn't care about him. The city seemed to blur around him, its towering buildings and bustling streets nothing more than a backdrop to his panic. The world felt too big, too cold for a boy of his size, but in this moment, all that mattered was getting to the one person who could help. Officer Thompson. He had seen the officer many times before, standing at street corners, watching over the neighborhood. Lucas didn't know him personally, but he knew that officers like Thompson were supposed to keep the peace. They were supposed to protect people. That's what he had been taught. "Help! They took Mommy!" Lucas screamed, his voice cracking with fear. His legs burned as he ran faster, desperately hoping someone would hear him, someone would listen. He wasn't sure where to go, but Officer Thompson was close, just up ahead. The officer was leaning against his patrol car, his eyes scanning the street with a watchful gaze, seemingly unfazed by the chaos unfolding just a few blocks away. The sight of him should have brought comfort, but instead Lucas felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. What if the officer didn't believe him? What if no one did? Lucas's mind raced with thoughts he couldn't quite organize, a jumble of fear and confusion. He had no time for the doubts. His mother needed him, and Officer Thompson was the only person in uniform he had ever seen up close, the only one who could help. As he drew closer, Lucas's small voice trembled with panic. "Please, officer, they took my Mommy. You have to help me." Officer Thompson looked down at the boy, his expression unreadable. The officer was in his 40s, his face lined with the weariness of years spent in the force. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming in the sunlight. But there was something about his eyes, something cold, skeptical. Thompson stood straight, one hand resting on the side of his patrol car, the other clasped loosely around his belt. His gaze flickered over Lucas, taking in the sight of the terrified child, his face streaked with tears, his clothes rumpled from the frantic sprint. But his mind, shaped by years of racial bias and hardened by countless interactions in neighborhoods like this one, hesitated. He had seen children in distress before, but they weren't always telling the truth. Too many times he'd dealt with situations that turned out to be exaggerated stories, misunderstandings that only added to the confusion of his daily work. "Are you sure, kid?" Officer Thompson's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a weariness from dealing with more false alarms than he cared to remember. "Where did they take your mom?" Lucas shook his head frantically, his voice cracking again. "I don't know. I saw them take her. They put her in a van. Please, officer, you have to help." His hands were trembling, and he instinctively wiped his nose with the back of his hand, too distraught to care about the smudges of dirt or the tears that blurred his vision. Officer Thompson watched him for a moment longer, the skepticism still hanging in the air between them. His experience with this community, this neighborhood where kids often got into trouble, where families were constantly under scrutiny, taught him to question every story. Every time an incident like this came up, there was always a chance it wasn't as serious as it seemed. It was possible, he thought, that Lucas was just upset, that maybe he had imagined the whole thing, or that the boy had misunderstood the situation. But something about the child's urgency, the way his hands gripped at his sides, his wild eyes darting to every passing car, as though he were afraid the van might come back, made Thompson hesitate. The officer had seen children like Lucas before, kids from broken homes, from neighborhoods where survival was an everyday struggle. He had learned to distance himself emotionally from the chaos around him, to separate his personal feelings from his work. But now, standing before this boy, Thompson could feel the weight of his own hesitation pressing against him. Something wasn't right. He shifted his weight, his brow furrowing as he tried to make sense of the situation. "Look, kid, calm down. We'll find your mom. Thompson said, but his words lacked the reassurance they should have carried. The thought of chasing down a van for an emotional outburst made him hesitate. This wasn't his usual routine. His instincts, formed over years of policing, told him this might just be another case of overreacting. But something in the boy's voice, in the frantic pleading, told him otherwise. Lucas stepped forward, tears streaming down his face. "I'm not lying. Please, please help me." His voice cracked with desperation, his small body trembling as though the fear and the tension were too much to hold. Officer Thompson stood still, his expression unreadable. He glanced toward his patrol car, his fingers twitching slightly as he debated what to do next. He could ignore this, pretend it was just a child's outburst. But there was something gnawing at him, a small voice deep down telling him he couldn't afford to make that mistake. "Okay," he finally said, his tone still guarded but less dismissive. "I'll call it in. Stay here. I'm going to check it out." Lucas nodded, relief flooding through him, though the fear still clenched at his chest. He hadn't been sure if the officer would believe him, but now he had a chance. Now, maybe, just maybe, someone would listen. Officer Thompson's pulse quickened as he stared at the phone in his hand, the number for the precinct's dispatch center still glowing on the screen. He had made the call, and now he was waiting. Lucas, the small, scared boy who had run to him for help, stood beside him, eyes wide and filled with hope. He hadn't let go of Thompson's side since the officer promised to help. The boy's trust was palpable, almost suffocating in its intensity, and Thompson could feel the weight of it, pushing him to act faster, harder, with more resolve than he had ever felt before. Lucas had been right. His mother had been taken. The reality of that truth sank deep into Thompson's bones as he thought about how many times he had seen similar situations unfold in this neighborhood, situations where the system had been just as unforgiving and unjust. But he had turned a blind eye. He had never questioned it before. It had always seemed like a way of life, the way things worked. But now, standing at the precipice of a moral dilemma, he could no longer ignore the truth. "Where are they holding her?" Thompson muttered, more to himself than to Lucas. Lucas pointed ahead, the street lights casting long shadows on the pavement. They took her to the old station on Maple Street, the one by the warehouse. Thompson nodded, his mind already racing through the details. He had heard of that station. Rumors of corruption had floated through the force for years, but he had dismissed them, chalking them up to nothing more than hearsay. But now, with the boy's mother in the hands of the very system Thompson had once blindly served, the truth was becoming all too real. "Stay close, Lucas," Thompson said, his voice low but firm, the gravity of the situation clear in his tone. "We're going to get your mom." They both moved quickly through the quiet streets, the silence around them heavy with the tension of what was to come. Lucas's footsteps were quick and nervous, his small body still shaking from the fear and uncertainty. Thompson's own heart raced as they neared the old station, the shadows growing longer with each step. The station itself was a dark, run-down building, its cracked windows offering no hint of what lay inside. The air was thick with the smell of oil and concrete, the very air of decay and neglect. This was no ordinary precinct. This was the heart of something much darker. As they approached the entrance, Thompson's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the message. Backup had arrived. But there was no turning back now. It was time to face what had been hidden in plain sight for far too long. "We're here," Thompson said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lucas's face was tense, but there was a flicker of hope in his eyes, the first since the moment they had spoken. He was starting to believe that things might actually be okay, that his cries for help hadn't been in vain. Thompson pushed the door open, his body tense, ready for whatever confrontation might await. Inside, a small group of officers stood around, casual as if they didn't have a care in the world. But Thompson knew them. He recognized their faces and the way they carried themselves. These were the same officers who had taken Lucas's mother, the same ones who had been involved in the ongoing corruption that festered beneath the surface of the department. As he stepped further into the dimly lit room, one of the officers looked up, his eyes narrowing when he saw Thompson. There was no warmth, no surprise, just a cold recognition of a man who had once been part of their system, a man who had now turned his back on everything he had stood for. "Thompson," the officer greeted him curtly, his voice carrying a tone of disdain. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here to see a woman who you and your boys have illegally detained," Thompson replied, his voice steady but filled with an anger he could no longer contain. "And I'm here to make sure she's released. Now." The officers in the room exchanged looks, their faces unreadable, but the tension was palpable. Thompson knew what they were capable of. These men didn't just break the law, they lived in it, operated under it, twisted it to fit their own needs, and Thompson had been complicit in their system for far too long. "Get out of the way, Thompson," one of the officers spat, his hand twitching near his holstered gun. "You don't know what you're talking about. This is how it works." Thompson's hand went to his own gun, but it wasn't the weapon he was reaching for. It was his badge. He held it up, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Number. This is not how it works. Not anymore." The room went silent, and for a brief moment Thompson wasn't just another officer. He wasn't part of the system anymore. He was standing for something bigger, for justice, for a boy who had lost his mother and was afraid he would never see her again. He was standing for the truth that had been buried for too long. "Get her out of here," Thompson commanded. "Now." The officers hesitated, but they knew what would happen if they pushed back. The entire department was under scrutiny, and Thompson's words had the weight of truth behind them. There would be no covering this up. After a tense moment, the door to the back room creaked open, and Lucas's mother, her face pale but relieved, stepped into the light. Lucas rushed to her, throwing himself into her arms, his tears a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "Mommy, you're okay," he sobbed, his small voice cracking with emotion. Lucas's mother wrapped him in her arms, holding him tight, as though she feared she might lose him again. She looked up at Thompson, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaking. Thompson nodded, a rare sense of peace settling in his chest. "It's not over, but it's a start." As they left the building, the weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. For the first time, Officer Thompson didn't just feel like a cog in the machine. He felt like he had made a difference, even if it was just for one boy and his mother. And as Lucas and his mom walked away, hand in hand, Thompson knew the fight wasn't over. But it was a fight he was now ready to face. In a world where voices are often silenced by prejudice, Lucas's desperate plea for help sparked a change. It wasn't just a cry for his mother. It was a call that reverberated through the system and shook Officer Thompson to his core. Lucas's small voice, filled with fear and urgency, acted as a catalyst for something bigger, a reckoning that stretched beyond one officer, beyond one child, to the very heart of a broken system. When Officer Thompson first encountered Lucas, he had been unsure, skeptical, dismissive even. He was a man shaped by years of ingrained assumptions, a product of the biases that run deep within systems of authority. For him, the world had always been a certain way. His perspective had been narrow, and he never truly questioned the narratives that had been handed to him, until that moment when he found himself face to face with a frightened boy, standing at the crossroads of justice and indifference. Lucas, with his desperate plea, became the turning point not only in his own life, but in the officer's as well. The officer's internal conflict wasn't just about a boy needing help. It was about his entire worldview crumbling in real time. In that moment, Officer Thompson realized that he could no longer stand on the sidelines. He couldn't ignore what was happening in front of him. His biases had led him to doubt Lucas when the boy needed him the most, and now, as he looked back on his actions, he saw just how much harm had been caused by that skepticism. But it was also in this realization that his transformation began. Lucas had shown him a new path, a path of empathy, where doing what was right meant confronting uncomfortable truths. The weight of that understanding hit Thompson hard, but with it came a sense of responsibility. It wasn't enough to simply recognize the problem. He had to take action. He had to challenge the system he had once upheld without question. And in that pivotal moment when Lucas's cries led them to the truth, Thompson knew that he had to stand up. He had to break free from the silence that perpetuated injustice. Lucas, in his innocence, had unknowingly forced that change. His actions didn't just save his mother. They saved an officer from remaining complicit in a broken system. He showed Thompson that courage doesn't come from power or authority. It comes from the truth, no matter how small or how seemingly insignificant it may appear. The release of Lucas's mother from the hands of corrupt officers was a victory, but it wasn't the end of the fight. It was a single moment, a small victory in the larger war against systemic racism, but it was also a step toward something more significant. Officer Thompson, having confronted his own biases, could now look at the world through a different lens. He could no longer be a passive observer in the fight for justice. He had learned that justice wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about upholding the rights and dignity of every individual, regardless of their race or background. As Lucas and his mother walked away from the old station, hand in hand, their future uncertain but safer than it had been moments before, Thompson felt the weight of the change he had just gone through. He had seen firsthand how a single voice, one that many would have ignored or silenced, could alter the course of an entire situation. And in that voice, he had found his own redemption. Lucas's bravery was a reminder that justice is often sparked by those who have the least power to demand it. It's not always the loudest voices that make the difference, but the quiet cries for help that break through the noise. This was Lucas's gift to Officer Thompson, the lesson that even the smallest act of courage can disrupt the status quo and set a new course for change. Viewer engagement. Question: have you ever been in a position to challenge what you thought you knew? How can we break down the barriers of prejudice in our society? Think about the moments when you were faced with your own biases or preconceived notions. How did you handle them? And how can we, as individuals, challenge these ideas to create a world where empathy and justice triumph over ignorance and prejudice?